So I'm executive director of the Crux Alliance. For context, the Crux Alliance is a group of technically based or technically oriented organizations that support policymakers around the world in the top 20 leading countries to craft bold decarbonization policies in the energy sector. Before coming to Crux, I was actually at an organization called Securing America's Future Energy, or SAFE. And that organization based in DC was actually dedicated to, or is dedicated to, getting oil out of the transportation sector, but not for climate reasons or environment, but for national and energy security reasons. So that's where I first got exposed to this topic. Fascinating topic, and we've got a great panel here to lead us through this conversation. I should say we will sort of go through a series of questions I have for the panelists, and then we will open it up to the audience. So if you, is this the Slido? Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you, I'm gonna get out of the way. If you, this one, that QR code will take the Slido, and you can type in questions there. And we can also ask questions from the crowd. We'll do that last 10-15 minutes. My goal for this session is to come away with two things. One is to have a clear definition of what we mean by energy security in the energy transition. I think energy security is kind of changing, and I want to make sure we all have a clear common understanding of what that is. And then secondly, related, because we're kind of a policy oriented alliance, what are some of the policies that we should put in place to ensure that energy security is part of the energy transition? So to walk us through that, or help us answer those questions, we have a wonderful panel of experts. I think I can do this on notes. Heather Thompson is the executive director of the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, based here in New York, but offices around the world. Prior to that, and they focus on urban mobility and urban design, as well as other important topics. Before that, Heather, she's been with ICP for many, many years in many different roles. Before that, she co-founded and was VP of programs, right, at the Climate Works Foundation. So, welcome, Heather. Dr. Julia Metz is here from Agora Industry. Agora Industry is one of the leading think tanks in Europe with partner organizations around the world. She manages the full suite of activities for the industrial program at Agora, and had many years advising governments, members of parliament, and other think tanks in Germany, based in Berlin. Yes. Ben Prohaska, he is the executive director of the Electrification Coalition, a sister organization to Securing America's Future Energy. Ben has been there forever. No. Kind of. As long as I can remember, but a good 10 years or so, managing those programs. 13. Prior to that, he was at Fieldworks, which was an organizing, a lead organizing team that did work across a range of fields, right? Yeah. And then, last but not least, we have Samantha Gross from the Brookings Institution, who runs their energy security and climate practice. Yes. Great. Well, wonderful. Welcome, everybody. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you. Okay. And let's see what let's make sure I hit everything. Got it. Okay. So to help us get to those answers for what is energy security and what are the policies that help us ensure it as we go through this energy transition, let me sort of set up a little bit of a straw person. So in the 20th century, one could argue that energy security meant access to reliable and affordable fossil fuels, especially oil. I don't think that's where we are today, but I want to use the panel to help us think through that. Samantha, why don't I start with you? You recently put out a paper that talks about the trilemma of security, affordability, and sustainability. And so before we get into the dynamics of that, I would love your critique of sort of my little straw person description of what energy security is and how you think it may have changed or may is changing.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, when we think about old school energy security, we think primarily about oil. You know, we think back to the oil embargoes in the 1970s and the gas lines, which I'm old enough to remember, but I'm not sure if a lot of other people are. Yeah. But it used to be about fuel. But when I think of energy security more broadly, I think about energy being available how you want it and when you want it. And now that's really spread out beyond fuels to also mean electrons. And an excellent example for that is the blackout that recently occurred in Spain and Portugal. I, oddly enough, happened to be spending the day in Boston with some of my funders from Portugal. And they couldn't get a hold of their families. It was quite a disaster. But there's different kinds of energy security beyond just can we get the fuel from these far-flung places. In fact, energy security is still a thing for the United States, even though we're the world's largest producer of oil and gas. You hear about concerns about AI raising electricity prices, and will we have enough electricity for this? That's an energy security issue. And the last thing that I'll say is we talk about, I wish they had coined this a three-legged stool rather than a trilemma, because it implies balance between security, affordability, and sustainability. But affordability and security are really flip sides of the same coin. If something's not available, how does the market tell us that? Well, price goes up. And so we're very seldom in areas where fuel is just full on not available, with the possible exception of recent events in Ukraine and natural gas in parts of Europe. But we definitely see price spikes showing us that fuel is less secure. And so those are really flip sides of the same issue.
Thanks, Samantha. Ben, let me ask you. So, Samantha pointed to the fact that energy security is changing in the U.S. From your vantage point at the Electrification Coalition, how has this shifted the debate around electrification?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me join. Good to be here with everyone in an awesome setting. And I am already ready for a nap as part of Climate Week. It's just one of those things. It's like, I'm sure everyone else is exhausted too. So I appreciate the question. For those who, and Joe framed it up a little bit, but we basically work on transportation electrification in the U.S. and the idea being that. So look, the whole premise of the Electrification Coalition was the idea that oil has a monopoly on our transportation sector in the U.S. and that puts us at great economic and national security risk. And the story, and to follow this trilemma in the discussion, was a lot easier to talk about because it was pretty plain, right? It was like there's a clear challenge associated with that when 90+% of the vehicles on the road require oil to get from point A to point B. Once we become a net producer, that changes the whole sort of political dynamics, much more so than the realities, right? The realities are still there, which is ultimately it's an international commodity, supply and cost is manipulated by bad actors who don't share our democratic values. And so it continues to be the reality, but that doesn't it's changed dramatically in how you have to talk about the issue and why electrification still makes sense regardless of whether or not the US is a net producer. And part of that is we can't drill our way out of the problems that I just talked about, which is still access to supply, and also the way that prices can go up and down. But the other part of this is that we're sort of transitioning in the electrification side also to, as you brought up, this trilemma piece, which is affordability, access to vehicles, the shift to minerals, which is a whole other form of national security issue, and critical minerals. So the conversation is still very much about energy security and economic security, but it's now actually become more complex when you start to think about access to critical minerals, access to the vehicle supply chain. How do we think about the challenges that exist with China, who's has an outsized sort of role within the market? So how does that all then turn into, and getting back to the central question, I think in general what it means is we have to spend a little bit more time talking to policymakers about why it's still relevant and why energy security and national security is still a big part of the transportation challenges that exist. We just have to frame them in new ways, but the challenges are still there.
Are there other sort of new clean technologies that offer greater energy security? I want to be careful that I don't lean into my bias of transport and and vehicle electrification. So are there other technologies that we should be thinking about when we think about energy security? Julia, please.
Oh, of course. I mean, if you ask this question,
It's a little bit of a softball question. It's fair. It's fair.
But let me first add something on how the discussion on energy security has changed over time, and I would like to add one element because in the power sector, actually, the issue of security of supply has always, it has been a long time companion of the energy transition from early on. You know, whenever someone said, yeah, well, you know, let's build out renewables, there's always been this voice saying, yeah, but what about security of supply? You know, will the grid manage, etc. So, and I guess for the power sector, the new dimension, which has been added more recently, is not in addition to the security of delivery, the security of procurement, or where does the energy, where do the fuels actually come from for the power sector? So speaking of electrons, but because you asked about technologies, I mean, yesterday we had a discussion on heat pumps, and I was the person saying, okay, you know, when the others have been talking about small heat pumps for buildings, I was like, large heat pumps. Yeah. So for industry, actually, electrification is a key strategy to both decarbonize, but also to increase energy security, and meaning decreasing dependency of access to fossil fuels. And in particular for industry, where 3/4 of carbon emissions come from producing process heat. And why is this so carbon intensive? Well, because fossil fuels are being burnt, in large parts fossil gas, and large parts of this heat production can be switched to power-based technologies such as large heat pumps, but also electric arc furnaces, etc. So there's a full range of technologies there which can help to decarbonize and also increase energy security.
Great. I want to touch on the supply chain issue since you mentioned it. Julie, you want to stay for just a second? So you just put out a report on green steel and green iron, and that, if I understood correctly, green iron is, so green steel, you should try and produce green steel domestically. But green iron, one of the core inputs into green steel, may be a very useful commodity to trade between countries. Can you say a word about that, and then sort of how countries can strike the right balance between sort of building up domestic industries, but then still having global competitiveness?
Yeah, exactly. So if you look at the transition of the steel sector to climate neutral or green steel production, one of the key transition pathways is to switch from coal-based steel making and blast furnaces to hydrogen-based steel making in so-called DRI plants. And this changes the dynamics and the economics of steel production, meaning that the first stage of steel production, this reducing iron to so-called hot briquetted iron, so green iron, is cheaper, more cost-effective in areas where there are abundant renewables and also ideally also iron resources. So as countries transition to green steel making, we argue that it would make lots of sense to also diversify the supply chain. So switching from importing iron to importing green, hot briquetted green iron from areas where there are abundant renewables. And this would mean having the first stage of steel production moving into other areas. However, because this concerns steel making, and steel is considered as a critical material, right? So countries like to have a bit of steel making at home to be self-sufficient. We argue that actually it should be, it's smart for countries to to take an industrial or strategy towards steel transitioning by both supporting the domestic steel transition to green steel making, and also partner up with other regions with abundant renewables, such as Brazil, South Africa, Australia, and import this first step of steel making. So we need this dual strategy, and this needs to be integrated into the industrial strategy, also considering the domestic element, but also the external element.
And there is this this argument that, and Ben, I think you might have touched on it too, of supply chain risk from OPEC in the last century, and now it's a supply chain risk with China. Are those the same thing? They feel fundamentally different. Go ahead.
I'm happy to talk about that.
Yeah.
I mean, you see in the political arguments here in the U.S. that we're trading good old American fossil fuels for stuff from China.
Yep.
That argument frustrates me to no end, in part because of the really important difference between fuels and raw materials. So if I don't have fuel to run my little Mini Cooper, it stops now-ish. In the overall scheme of things, you're talking about days when parts of the economy come to a screaming halt. Whereas if you're talking about raw materials, the old stuff still works. You just can't build new stuff. So you have a problem that plays out over many months, rather than a problem that plays out over a matter of days. And the other thing is, because these raw materials are often in much smaller quantities than fuel, it's easier to stockpile them, easier to think about diversification. Like it's just an easier thing to deal with, rather than a potential cutoff in the massive quantities of fuel that we get. So no, they're not the same thing at a basic level.
There's two different parts. I mean, one is that we think of this in the idea of the supply chain that we need to create for critical minerals. So we're going from, some could argue, a fossil fuel-based economy to a minerals-based economy. Mm-hmm. And the batteries, as you asked the question, what other things are happening? Batteries are not just for vehicles, they're for a whole bunch of things. But the other part is, and it's an important part of the rationale right now, is the critical minerals that the EV industry creates, or the demand that the EV industry creates, is really important for the US, because there's lots of places we need these critical minerals. It's our defense systems, it's other parts of our economy, and many of those other parts of our economy, or in this case the defense sector, doesn't have enough demand in and of itself to create the supply chain and robust, secure, reliable supply chain that's needed to meet that critical mineral demand. And so it's an important part of the EV industry, has this really big role to play in energy security or mineral security, that sometimes is sort of not front and center. Instead, they're here to save the climate, true, but we really have a chance to, I think, broaden the aperture around why EVs are really critical to the US and the rest of the world. And that does then create this interesting challenge with China, because if they do control all the lithium, or they do control all the processing capacity, or in this case, they're rapidly accelerating from their auto industry starting in 2008 to now where they've sold more EVs than we actually sell vehicles in the US, right? There's this balance that starts to get out of whack, and it could really mean that this authoritarian regime that can obviously put a lot of state-sponsored resources behind this industry, and they've demonstrated that in lots of other examples in the renewable side with solar. And so it's a really important time for the U.S. to go, wait a minute, we need to figure this out, otherwise we're going to get left behind. Yeah. And we don't have all the demand we need to create the access to critical minerals.
And that seemed to be part of the motivation for the IRA in the U.S. Unfortunately, it's being dismantled, and so it sounds like the argument is this is putting us further behind and putting us more in debt to the fossil fuel interests that we've been indebted to for past several decades, many decades. Heather, I want to bring you in. I was just thinking about electric buses. The Chinese manufacturers, sort of their vehicles, they're going around exporting around the world. In the places where you work, are you seeing the rise of sort of the Chinese electric bus? Or are you seeing what is sort of the uptake of the electric bus in your work? And does that have a energy security angle when you're talking to policymakers?
Yeah, I think there's been reference to those of us that have been around the block for a number of years. So those of us that have been around the block for a while, you know, the term energy security isn't new, but it's coming up in different ways than it did in the past. For ITDP, we predominantly work in the global south. And so most of these countries are oil importers. And, you know, maybe 20 years ago when we talked about energy security, was there enough energy to turn the lights on? And now when we're talking about energy security, it's much more about oil imports and the cost of those oil imports. Especially for lower income countries where they have limited dollars or foreign currencies, and they have to spend that limited foreign currency on oil imports. So it's an issue of major national security, unlike we talk about in the US, but major energy national security for many, many countries. And also we see that many of these countries have huge amounts of renewable energy. Of course, not all countries, but there are many countries in the world. Brazil, where we're hosting the COP this year, a ton of renewable energy from hydro. Countries that we work in East Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, a lot of geothermal, other forms of renewable energy that they have invested in specifically for energy security reasons, and understanding that it's been, you know, a political quagmire for them for many years. So they're moving to adopt electric vehicles, buses, but electric vehicles of all types, because they can eventually plug it into a green grid and not be dependent on oil imports and save that money for other uses. So we see countries like Ethiopia deciding in 2024 to ban all imports of conventional ICE vehicles. They didn't do this for climate change. Of course, they understand that this has health benefits with air pollution and other things that they're concerned about, but really, they did it for energy security reasons. And, you know, they are importing vehicles from China. Earlier this year, they received about 100 buses from China, and they don't seem to have a problem with it. Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, they have had, you know, political dependencies on countries always, and I think they actually see that whether it's the Chinese or the Koreans or other economies that are really interested in the future, that this is a bet that they're willing to make. And I think the one that they feel like there's actually more security in. And we see that in places around the world. Of course, not all countries have the vantage point of having renewable energy, but where we do, we really see that shift to embracing electric vehicles. Again, climate change is not mentioned, just like 20 years ago when we try to do all these things and we didn't mention climate change. Yeah. Sometimes there's no need to mention climate change.
And so you talked about hooking all these great vehicles, electric vehicles, up to, you know, a grid, right? And, you know, electrification does offer us opportunities for a greater or less dependency, let's say, on fossil fuels. But it does require some upfront costs. It does require some investment. Does it require new financing models, or are the financing schemes there?
Yeah, I think that is the big challenge with electrification. You know, if you look at the total cost of ownership or the expense of a vehicle over the lifetime of that vehicle, an electric vehicle is going to be cheaper in pretty much every economy at this point, especially as we have more of those vehicles and the price of the vehicles is coming down. But the upfront cost of the vehicles is higher. So, you know, there are people in Ethiopia clamoring for an electric vehicle because they don't have to pay the price of the fuel, you know, every day as it goes, but they can't afford the upfront cost. So it's all about coming up with financing mechanisms that essentially can provide the purchaser, whether it's a city buying several hundred buses or an individual buying a motorcycle, the availability of that upfront cost. And we see a lot of interesting policies that are being set up at the government level, large scale, but also private sector businesses that are coming in to offer support. So for example, I mentioned in Ethiopia, throughout East Africa, there's a newish company called Bosigo that essentially partners with lenders to provide upfront capital so that somebody, doing a motorcycle delivery company can buy a motorcycle with their support and then pay back for that motorcycle like a microloan. They pay it back incrementally every day or every week and eventually pay off that loan. Similar things are being done at the larger scale where new electricity companies are coming in and investing in the grids, investing in a fleet of electric buses, and then that price is paid back through the charge of electricity on the grid over time. So we're finding these players, whether they're governments, multilateral banks, private banks, that can provide that upfront capital and then find these mechanisms set by policy, backed by policy, to help finance the transition.
Yeah. Yeah, Julia.
Yeah, maybe I think that because you mentioned the security or energy security and how this is linked to affordability, and I think that it can be that government needs to be like there's a cost to pay to increase energy security, and I'm saying this based on the experience we made in Europe. Following the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And lots of European industry actually having built their business model on supplying supposedly cheap fossil gas from Russia. And however, and this then, we all know this, over just a few weeks' time, the supply has been cut, meaning that 50% of gas supply to Europe has been cut. And the societal costs associated with this is something that private companies wouldn't necessarily factor in when signing energy supply deals or procurement deals. So I think there would need to be a willingness to pay from governments to say, okay, we're willing to pay this, resilience premium, whatever, because it won't be covered by the market, right? Because the societal costs of less energy security isn't sufficiently factored in decisions of private companies.
Although I will say, this is very brief, after what happened, I think there may be a new willingness to pay for resiliency. I think it's sort of obvious up front what you're paying in the additional cost. For an electric vehicle, for instance, but less obvious what your potential cost would be if you're less secure. Whereas I think because this has been sort of brought to light in such a dramatic way for most of a continent, I think we may have more willingness to pay for new things. So it may be a moment of willingness to pay for energy security in a way that also helps the electrification push, which is a good thing. Never waste a good crisis.
It's a good opportunity. The other thing about economic security though is that the high costs are bad just as much as when you see these valleys, right? And I think that has a big impact on. In the U.S., you can tie most recessions to when we've had these sort of challenges with our access to supply for oil or changes in price. Yeah. And so actually the certainty of the electricity market is one of the things that has a lot of value here. The other part though is when we think about just the scale, EVs, we've gone from where a cost per kilowatt hour is somewhere around $1,200 to $1,500 on a cost per kilowatt hour for the battery. So now we're getting down to $90 to $100 for the cost per kilowatt hour. And that's mostly the idea of scale. Right? We're hitting that manufacturing scale. We're also improving the technology, right? So it's first gen was pretty rough. In fact, if you bought a Leaf as a starter, which I had,
Do we have to go there?
It's okay to
Don't worry, it's now being well used in places like Nairobi.
Well, there are lots of applications, and
True story.
My 16-year-old is going to get a car that goes about 90 miles. That actually sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I don't need her going all over the place. But it's the first gen was just not as good or compelling.
Yeah.
as they currently are. And then we also have like a habit issue there too. And I'm getting a little off the subject of security,
Sure.
but it is this thing where, people have this sort of what their expectation is, your Mini Cooper, and when that, will work or not work, and how you access the fuel supply. And so we're in this culture change, this, shift that has to happen around how plugging in every night is how this works, but it takes a while for consumers to go through that change.
It's another definition of security. It's the personal security that my transportation will go where I need it to go.
It's all security.
And sometimes it's perception.
Yeah.
So I was in Portugal shortly after the blackout, and I was in a cab with, and I was talking to the cab driver, a very nice guy. I saw a number of EVs, and I said, "Oh, is Portugal investing in electric vehicles?" And he said, "Well, yeah." I said, "How was it? How are they doing?" He's like, "Well, they're okay, but like with the blackout, they couldn't run." I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Yeah, in fact, I couldn't like fill up at the gas station because all the pumps were off either." I said, isn't that the same thing?" Like, yeah. So you just have these mental models in your head, and unless someone gently challenges them, you just keep them. But then you realize, oh right, and it was very funny. He's like, I hadn't thought of it that way. Right? Or I had a friend who said, yes, but if you get an induction stove, if the electricity goes out, your range goes out. I'm like, so does your gas stove.
Yeah.
Because it's also plugged in. It's like, oh. Again, your barbecue in the back on the propane tank, you'll be fine. Anyway, last question on the finance stuff. Should we engage more with finance ministries, or are we engaging with finance ministries?
Not enough.
Not
I
enough,
think.
okay.
I feel like we've been saying that in climate discussions again for years, that we need to make sure that there's actually the ministers of finance that are paying attention to this, because again, it's not just about environmental issues as we're here to talk about it. It's about so much more. And again, like so often we're talking about issues of national interest, and I think it's just like this side issue, and we need to make sure they're really seen as the same. And again, maybe which I think we're again all here to talk about, like we don't need to mention climate change to get the things done that we need to get done sometimes, but we probably do need to be talking a lot more about energy security directly to the people that care about, and get those policies locked in for those reasons. And we can claim the climate victories and wisdom later, but really we should be playing to the things that they care about.
Here, I mean, GGRF funds or greenhouse gas reduction funds were, a problem, or are a problem now because of the new administration.
Can you remind folks what those were for?
Yeah, so there was a bunch of money that was basically put into green banks of sorts, and so then they were going to create financing schemes, and they're kind of caught up in court battles right now and question marks about what they'll have access to or not access to, even though some of the money's already deployed and doing good things and demonstrating that this can in fact work. Yeah. But there are, it maybe is an opportunity, good, crisis creates opportunity for the private sector to get into the game a little bit more. And as buses are a good example where we have Highland Electric in the US, and they actually have created an ESCO model of sorts. It's buses as a service. So instead of paying for the asset up front, which can be more, they're basically amortizing those costs. Yeah. And so school districts are paying on a cost per mile basis. And in some ways that's great, right? When we can get into that, you don't have to care whether or not you think EVs are a good idea. Then you're just getting into whether or not the cost factor is there over that total lifespan of the vehicle or operational costs. Yeah. And they're proving it's the right thing. And so it's a great place for the US to make the argument that this is the best use of taxpayer dollars when it comes to school districts or transit districts. And so there's just lots of opportunity for financing schemes to solve that upfront capital issue.
All right, last couple questions, then we'll turn it to audience questions. So, all right, I did say we wanted to get a sense of the policies that would help energy security. So, give me a sense of your policy recommendations. If I'm a policymaker and you're coming to me and saying we need to have energy security be part of this energy transition, where do you land on policy recommendations?
Well, like all of these things underlying them, we're talking about markets essentially. So I think like everything, providing signals about where the market is going just helps with investment. So there's certainly, I'm sure, a lot on the energy side, On the transportation side, again, I referenced this great example from Ethiopia of them just deciding to ban imports of conventional vehicles. That sends a huge signal to everyone in the country about the direction and brings more certainty to that. So I think commitments like that, as well as different policies that can help make sure that the direction that we're going in remains. So again, electrification, we're plugging into a grid for electricity. The price of that electricity and the time of day pricing of that electricity is set often by the government in some way or another. And that has a huge implication as to whether or not the electricity is going to be more favorable, or if still going to the fuel station and maybe getting overly subsidized fuel is cheaper. So, you know, setting those policies that set up the pricing structure is a huge component to making sure that all of this equation is favorable. And again, even though we're talking about finance, ultimately it starts with government policy.
Yeah, winding down subsidies for fuels is a difficult challenge to bring it into cost parity, as many countries have seen.
The subsidy trap, as I like to call it.
The subsidy trap, that's very good.
Yeah, in so many countries. Indonesia is one I think many of us work in, where, the country wants to do the right thing, but politically is really stuck in a subsidy trap. Because of course, the people are dependent now on these subsidies. Politically, that's a huge dynamic. So shifting away from that to the new, more, they realize energy secure world, though, is a very tough political thing to do.
Okay, great policy advice.
Yeah, you asked about policies, but I would like to answer also a bit on institutions, because you mentioned the finance ministry. And I think if your question is as broad as asking, okay, how do we really combine or have energy security and the energy transition combined, I think it's also really related to the institutional structure of governance or governance. And my experience is that very often the responsibility for domestic energy policy is separated from the responsibility for external energy policy or international affairs, etc. Yeah. So this piece you mentioned on the green steel transition, which we published, one part, so in Germany, for example, one part of government responsible for domestic industrial policy was like, really, like, shouldn't we only protect our domestic steel industry? But then another department responsible for international affairs, they just loved our piece because it has a strong emphasis on international collaboration. And ideally, both would be part of a joint, coherent strategy for, be it the energy transition, or in my field, actually the industrial transformation, including the industrial strategy, to ensure that both elements, the domestic resilience, but also resilience in terms of diversifying supply chains, are considered together.
I thought you were going to say CBAM. CBAM is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which Europe is championing. But that was a much more nuanced response.
I think there's an opportunity to, from a policy perspective, to focus much more on the idea of diversity of fuel sources, and in some ways it gets again away from the climate conversation, and instead it is about economic resilience. And so by plugging into the grid, like, sure, it should be renewable and green and all these things, but you don't have to actually have that be the requirement for it to be something where it's, you're plugging into the grid, and so you have the greatest diversity of how you're going to power our future of transportation. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough to then say this is why we should be prioritizing moving transportation to the electric grid instead of continuing to be on this mono-fuel path.
Right.
Couple real policy things though, we need to couple regulation with incentive policy. It's one of the mistakes we made really in the US is we over-indexed on regulation. It makes a lot of sense, right? It creates market certainty. You're sort of forcing the industry to shift. But there's a point at which the sort of public didn't agree with that, and so you needed this other side, and the industry sort of argued against these regulations. And if we had had much more robust incentives, like what was in IRA, and so I think there's an opportunity to do that in the U.S. at the state level now. I think we're probably stuck a little bit at the federal level for a little while, but to create incentive policies, and then there's ways to focus on things like they've not always been that popular, but low carbon fuel standard or competitive fuel standards. So California has a good example, but it's sort of a cap and invest or cap and trade type programs where you're generating revenue and then you can incentivize this shift. And I think we need to do that because it's about that demand side in addition to the supply side stuff that we need to do. And so that's a really important set of things that still need to happen or revitalize.
Yeah, makes sense.
This is a bit of a corollary, or in addition to what you're saying. I would like to see more policy emphasis on a better, smarter grid. The things so the grid, today, for the most part, sort of works one way. I demand power, the grid supplies power. Whereas we have the technology now, and more so with AI, it's not all just a power suck, it can also help us a lot. And manage the grid better such that the grid is trading information with consumers to try to balance power demand with supply. That enables us to do a lot of really good things, like build fewer peaking plants or run peaking plants less, which makes the whole grid cheaper. And so if we think about this systemically, there are ways to create and also to sell politically the fact that this isn't us suffering for the good of our grandchildren to deal with climate change. This is us building a better, more resilient, more diversified grid that is cheaper and better for everybody. And I can't figure out why we don't sell that more. I'm still a little baffled at that. Because the place we're going isn't a place of sacrifice. It's better.
Right.
And,
I mean, this is a question about communication. This is I promise the last one I'll ask. We mentioned banning all imports of ICE vehicles. That's great. That does not go over well in some places. Right? Banning boilers in Germany definitely did not go over well, right? And so
stuff in general.
Yeah, banning stuff, unless the conditions are really right, banning is not a winner. Perception, right? Like the Lisbon taxi driver that I was talking to, but also if you say, oh, you should hook up your car to the grid for power, in lots of places the grid is not reliable. And so any thoughts you have about the communications challenges of energy security? I know we started touching on it, but any closing comments on that?
Maybe I'll just start with the ban.
It wasn't your ban.
I think the term leapfrogging is used maybe too often. I'm not sure, but I do think that there are leapfrogging opportunities. And if somebody told you that they were banning your wired telephone, you probably wouldn't have a problem with it. I mean, it's actually happening in places where we have had wired telephone because now you have a mobile phone and who cares? And if you really never had that wired telephone, then you really don't care, right? And so many of the countries that we're talking about, they haven't been driving around their gas guzzler trucks that they're wedded to. They just want the new technology of the new world that works. And so in a lot of places, we don't have to necessarily talk about banning. We just talk about, we're only bringing in the good stuff for you people. That's what we're doing. We're bringing in the good stuff. So I think, again, like coming back to some of the core messages and not talking about those kind of scarier, kind of ultimatum ways of talking, it really resonates. And, so often this is more conversations direct with the government, less so with people. I mean, people just want a good thing to buy at the end of the day, and they want to know that their needs are being met.
Yeah.
Different in the U.S.
Yeah. I think of the U.S. as it's like, they're gonna take the pedal away from my cold dead foot. It's a reference to another type of thing that people often have pretty big debates about.
Right.
And so I do think that it elicits this immediate response of how dare they decide to do this. And then there's also a little bit of like, we've had this American, like the Great American Road Trip. It's like this emotional response and gearheads and all these things. And so I think that that's just a culture thing that then we're sort of fighting against.
Yeah.
Instead of, let's talk about how good the technology is. Let's talk about the idea of how it is this dramatic improvement. And there's changes, right? You have to do it differently.
Yeah.
And that's where people have like sort of this perception. And I think that's a big challenge with the EVs right now is the perception is remarkably different than the reality.
Yeah.
But most people don't have a way to change their own perception, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I think there's a little bit of a cul-de-sac effect that's happening with EVs, where if one person owns one in a neighborhood, they tend to, I mean, EV owners talk way too much about their cars, like just, they're like crazy.
Yeah.
But it is this thing where it changes, it is good, but it's just that it changes then immediately the idea of how you interact. The other part is, in the US at least, we have a sales channel that is
That's true.
broken,
Right.
I mean, really, if there's anybody who owns a dealership, sorry, but it's basically a mafia. And, you know, they have this franchise that they've been able to manage and develop in each state and manipulate the market. And it's pretty crazy because these are basically people who would be free market type folks.
Yeah.
But then they've managed to actually constrain and control the market. And it's why we also bring in freedom to buy principle and the idea that any EV doesn't have to be sold through a dealership. Why can we buy a computer at Best Buy or at an Apple store?
Right.
Why can't we do the same thing with cars?
Right.
But we still have a lot of work to do to solve that. And, you know, unfortunately, policy isn't always the best thing. It's the politics are dictating what we actually do.
Yeah.
I do love that in maybe more progressive places like California, you are now able to walk into a mall and next to the Apple store is an EV store, which is pretty cool. So hopefully we're beginning to break that. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, last couple comments.
Yeah, on communication. So I think, I mean, it's really interesting that the topic of the power outage in Spain and Portugal came up. You know, it's crazy how this went viral.
Yeah.
And what about all these power outages caused by or taking place in regions and countries with lots of fossil fuels?
Right.
No, like name one. Yeah. You know, people don't know about it, and I think a learning of this event is that it's not really learning because we do it anyway, but also associated to energy security is for us think tanks to really brief the media. And I'm looking to Kaisa, our press and comms lead. I mean, we do this a lot, based on our analysis to brief media for next time when that happens. Because I mean, the voices or the forces arguing against renewables build out, you know, arguing with this power outage, they are there, you know, like.
Yeah. Ready.
Yes, ready, exactly.
Yeah.
And and actually we have been making quite a good experience regarding the rise of energy prices in Europe, where also the voices have been there. Oh yeah, it's due to the renewables build out.
Yeah.
And we could show based on our analysis, no, it's largely associated to the fossil gas. Fossil gas.
Relying too much on fossil fuels.
Exactly. And that's our role to actually brief the media because they play a massively important role in the way how things
That's right.
associated to the energy transition are communicated.
Yeah. All right. I promised I would not ask another question, so I will refrain. We have some questions here, and if people want to raise their hand too, that's fine. Okay. Are PPPs a real option to increase electrification in transport and other sectors?
Yes.
Yeah.
Next question.
Now that's communications. Okay. All right. I see a difference between Heather's focus on Global South and what is needed there versus Ben's comments regarding authoritarianism in China. Can we say more about China?
Can I expand upon that?
Yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thank you all. This is really helpful. And I love, the framing of energy security and how to kind of think of that in the current context. And one thing that this really made me think of course, is the U.S. relationship with China and kind of global global system more broadly. And we're seeing, a lot of push and pull there. And so my question is kind of, when we think of energy security, how we can think about it in a way that's with a more global perspective and what the globe needs for climate. So the US is not the biggest emitter. It's not going to be moving forward, right? It's global south. It's Southeast Asia, it's Africa. And what's needed there is access to mainly solar panels from China, but the wider technology. And so I'm kind of interested in how you all are thinking about this. And then the current administration is tough, right? But we're seeing with tariffs and kind of economic bloc formation going on. We just saw that with Mexico, right? Pressuring the Sheinbaum administration to really kind of hurt their relationship with China. So I mean, it's a comment. I'm really interested in your thoughts from the perspective of global climate and really the transition that we need to see, how we ensure that global south countries have the finance they need, which largely is not coming from the global north right now, and have the access to materials they need from China, versus how we're seeing kind of US security in this myopic way and the challenges facing the global system right now.
I'll go.
Sorry, yeah.
Why not just dive right into the deep end of the pool?
Yeah.
I think that it is nuanced, and that's the important thing. Is there's nuance. Part of the concerns about something like China is not. The authoritarian thing matters, but it's also the idea of if the U.S. and other markets aren't competing in the auto industry, then we face some big problems in the future potentially. Like, what if China says, we're not going to just, we won't sell you batteries, we'll only sell you their car. And what if they start to dictate that around the world? And what if they have, and they've already started to do this, where they say, the battery has to come back to China and all the materials have to come back. Like, that creates then an ability for them to control all of the access to the minerals. And so I do think there's tensions here, right? Because I also agree, these are emerging parts of the world. Their transportation systems are growing rapidly, 2 and 3 wheel vehicle, all the stuff. And so access to cheap, reliable, good product, which China is creating, is really important for their ability to transition. I also think we need to remember all of the other things about environmental standards. China doesn't have a great track record there. Labor standards. China doesn't have a great track record there. And some ways we're not willing to sort of think about all of those things when we just are focused on one part of the equation, which is climate, really important, but we need to think about these other things. And that's where, the role of the US and the role of Europe as part of this industry is really important, because it will actually then allow us to realize all of those things, not just the cost, but also these other things around labor, et cetera. And then there's a last bit, which is, some of it's like cultural. China doesn't sort of think of IP in the same way that the rest of the world does, because of how their industry is set up. And so it does affect the idea of how they view intellectual property rights. And that's also showing up. And I think that that's a thing just to be aware of, and there's concern there about what that can look like in the future. But your answer is probably very different than what I just said. Not to speak for you.
No. I think it really depends on who you are and where you are. The fact of the matter is we talk about these issues as if a lot of countries actually have the power to make a difference, and they don't. Most countries are not manufacturing vehicles, they're importing vehicles. So the supply of vehicles is limited regardless. Most countries are importing the oldest, dirtiest cars that have been given away by others. So they would love to buy a new, clean vehicle that's made available to them, probably cheaper in some countries than other countries. They don't see that as a real security issue. They're not trying to get a hold of a bunch of minerals to put together batteries. It's just not necessarily on their horizon. There are countries, however, that are. Big players like Indonesia or Brazil. They definitely want to make sure that they're coming out on the other side of this equation in a good way. And it's not just for security reasons, it's because they traditionally have been auto manufacturers and they don't want to lose the corner on the market. So a country like Brazil has been pretty slow to get into electrification. They have had a BYD manufacturing plant for some years. That was a big signal, but they've been pretty slow. Now they see that, you know, they need to get into this market if they want to maintain their dominance in things like bus manufacturing, for example. So they're ramping up their domestic manufacturing, not just for domestic reasons, but for general market reasons. Where, you know, Indonesia, they really want, they're sitting on a ton of mineral resources. They want to be part of battery manufacturing, but again, it's that upfront capital to invest in that manufacturing. But they're interested in doing deals then with the Chinese and others that can invest in this, and why not? So it's I think the US positions this as like a trade-off that's necessarily negative. And certainly I have worries that we're trading in one, you know, situation for another, who knows? But I think at this point in time, the way we see it here is not the way others see it. It is about market opportunities and a much better offering for their people, and there's trade-offs. There's new deals being made. There's new joint ventures being made. Again, I referenced the BYD plant in Brazil as one of the first major auto manufacturing plants outside of China. I mean, I see that as a victory, not something to be worried about.
I have some. Sorry. Let's see. How can you leverage EVs as distributed energy resources more and take advantage of that?
That's
That
what we're
dynamic.
getting at.
Sure. A couple pieces. I mean, one is you mentioned it earlier about the idea of putting downward pressure, right, on rates and costs, because ultimately EVs get out to the grid. They can be, you know, they're smart vehicles, right? They're capable of actually bidirectional, and we're just now getting into that. Yeah, so the battery on the vehicle can become a part of the grid asset and basically provide power.
When there's a problem, the grid can pull.
Yeah, they call it V to G or V to I or V to X, or, you know, there's all these like V to something that doesn't really matter. I mean, it does, but the idea is that ultimately, and especially fleet settings, and especially larger format vehicles, like a school bus is a really good example, where it's not used all day, and so it has this really big battery, and then you have a fleet of them, and ultimately if it's capable of sending electricity to the grid, and then also pulling it off, right, then you can balance and you don't need the peaker plants, and that's where there's lots of cost. But it also means the way that EVs work, not just in demand response, they're also making grid efficiency super high, and that's it's like counterintuitive. I think to most people, they're like, oh, wouldn't more demand mean more cost? But actually, no. We're maximizing the grid utilization, and so it actually means the grid is performing at the greatest amount of efficiency, pulling down electrons when the greatest amount of capacity is there. Right. And that's what's cool about this idea of V to G too, or demand response, is then you can do the same thing. Most people are parking during the day, and as we get further into the technology and ability, and as long as people don't freak out, because people are going to be worried about the idea of, wait, you're taking what out of my car?
Yeah.
But it's, you know, so this is another moment where it's going to have to take some culture change, and it's why fleets are going to make the most sense versus average consumers. But you really can then deal with all those peak moments. And that's really, peak is, by the way, it's like, you know, 5 days a year or something. But that cost to electricity is huge, and that's what then throws the whole thing off.
And the political cost for that politician who has to deal with that, you know,
Yeah.
blackout that happens once every 5 years, once every 10 years. Systems built to have that kind of failure once every decade.
Like Texas was a recent example, right?
Texas was an example. Right.
And it got blamed on all kinds of renewables.
Right.
Reality was
over reliance on fossil fuels. But yeah.
Yeah, and even getting beyond that peakiest of peak, if you think of sort of power demand throughout a day and throughout a year, it's really, really long. It varies daily based on, you know, people's activities during the day versus when they go to bed at night. It varies based on the weather. And the thing is, if you have a more renewables-based system, the renewables are also quite lumpy. Solar varies exactly like you'd think it would do. Wind varies with the weather. And so what the EVs on the grid allow you to do, and also some other elements of a smarter grid, allow you to sort of even out that lumpiness of demand, or even it out such that it better matches supply. And when you combine the ability to store versus the ability to control loads, I mean, we all walk around with smartphones now, so it's not that big of a deal for me to get a text and be like, hey, can we call on your EV battery today? And you know, most of the time you're gonna be like, well, yeah, it's just sitting there. Whereas if I have a road trip planned, I hit no, I want to have the juice in my car. The ability to do that, and the fact that we have these massive communication devices in our pockets 24/7 allows us to operate the grid completely differently. And rather than the grid being prepared to supply whatever I demand, and no matter how crazy it is, 105 in the shade day, this two-way control and the storage that vehicle batteries can provide just gets you a much more efficient grid, not just for your super peaky days, but for just the ordinary lumpiness of power demand.
Julia.
I just wanted to add that, and industry.
Yes.
So industry that uses more power, so shifts away from the use of fossil gas, for example, and oil and coal, to electrified technologies can also provide much more flexibility to the grid. And the interesting part is that industry often says, oh no, you know, like we really can flexibilize our demand, our production. However, in Europe again, with the when we saw these high power prices and peaks also as a result of the, I don't know, energy market disturbance and the fossil gas crisis, actually really some substantial parts of industry really managed to flexibilize their demand. So yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to close with what I think is the definition of energy security. You guys correct me. You guys please be kind. All right. So it's access to affordable and reliable energy. And reliable, I also mean like volatile, like the price of oil goes up and down, right? Saudi Arabia, for the longest time, it was their ideal oil price was 3 years high, 1 year low. 3 years to get all the revenue, and 1 year to drive out competition. So, right, removing that volatility, the operational volatility of electricity is much better than fossil fuels. And then with a diverse supply chain, which, okay, that we talked about those challenges. There's challenges. However, there's a lack of collusion, right? So we want a diverse supply chain with a lack of collusion, because OPEC producers collude all the time in the open, very clear. That's my sort of definition of the energy security and energy transition. Would you add, amend, change any of that? It's good enough. Okay, all right, I'll take good enough. Okay, and then the policies, I've got more reliable, cheaper, smarter grid. So policies that help stimulate that. Figuring out the subsidy trap wind down, how you make that transition out of subsidies, and that requires a lot of nuanced policy making. A combination of regulations and incentives, right? So LCFS plus consumer incentives.
Carrots and sticks.
Carrots and sticks, yes. I've not heard that in a long time. Here we are, here. Back to the future. And then I've got policies that unite domestic and international incentives and their interests. And I put CBAM, but you didn't say CBAM. So I'm not going to say CBAM as a policy. Trade agreements and maybe domestic content requirements versus international imports. Okay. That is it. Hopefully that all sounds okay. Hopefully you now have some talking points when people say energy security. Oh, one last thing. Energy security is not energy independence, right?
No.
Right. Energy security is what we just defined. Energy independence is a myth.
Yes.
Right. No one's going to achieve energy independence because we are an interconnected global world. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.